The Mason family Thanksgiving of 1972 unfolded like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life, at least on the surface. Outside, November snow dusted the sprawling farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania that had hosted 4 generations of Mason family gatherings. Inside, the dining room gleamed with inherited china, polished silver, and crystal glasses that caught the light from tapered candles and the aging chandelier. 22-year-old Emily Mason sat at the far end of the extended table, her fingers nervously twisting the cloth napkin in her lap. She had returned from Berkeley with more than just her philosophy degree. Her clothes, her politics, her entire worldview had shifted during those 4 years away. Her long hair now hung straight and unadorned. Her dress was handmade cotton rather than department store polyester, and the ring in her nose had already drawn whispered comments from aunts who believed piercing anything but earlobes was something only tribal people did. At the head of the table, Grandfather Mason carved the turkey with ceremonial precision, his World War II service giving him unquestioned authority over these proceedings, as it did all family matters. Emily's father Richard sat at his right hand, positioned literally and figuratively as the heir apparent to family leadership. Her mother Catherine quietly directed the serving from her strategic position near the kitchen door, maintaining the appearance that this elaborate meal materialized without female exertion. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and various relations by marriage filled the remaining seats, their arrangement reflecting an unspoken hierarchy of Mason family standing. Only Daniel, Emily's cousin who had returned from Vietnam 6 months earlier, seemed as out of place as she felt. He sat across from her, his haunted eyes and too short hair marking him as another family member, transformed by experiences the others couldn't, or wouldn't, understand. "Before we begin," Grandfather Mason announced, raising his glass in what would be the first of many formal toasts throughout the meal, "let us give thanks for another year of Mason family prosperity and welcome home those who have been away." His gaze pointedly avoided both Emily and Daniel. May they remember the values that made this family what it is. Emily took a small sip of wine, her stomach already knotting with tension. She had rehearsed what she would say when inevitably asked about her plans now that college was finished. But no amount of preparation could fortify her against the collision of the person she had become, and the family that expected her to return unchanged from her California adventure. What she couldn't have anticipated was how completely that collision would transform the Mason family Thanksgiving, and how a single act of solidarity would reverberate through generations to come. The ritual of the meal progressed with the precision of long tradition. Platters circulated clockwise, each person taking modest portions with murmured thanks. Conversations remained carefully within acceptable parameters. Local church activities, business successes, children's achievements in sports and academics, politics, religion, and anything remotely controversial were studiously avoided, at least during the formal first course. Emily maintained strategic silence, responding to direct questions with minimal answers. Yes, the drive from California had been long. No, the weather in Berkeley wasn't much like Pennsylvania. When her Aunt Margaret inquired about her little hobby, the photography that had become Emily's passion and budding career, she offered only that it was going well, rather than explaining her recent gallery showing or the magazine that had published her documentary series on farm worker conditions. Across the table, Daniel remained equally reserved, his responses to questions about his service so abbreviated that people quickly stopped asking. The family had tacitly agreed that Vietnam was not to be discussed. His Silver Star Medal acknowledged with pride while the circumstances of its earning remained comfortably abstract. The fragile peace fractured when Uncle Howard, 3 glasses into the dinner wine, gestured toward Emily with his fork. "So I hear you've been participating in those protest movements out in California. Your grandfather and I were just saying how disappointed we are to see a Mason involved in such activities." The table fell into the particular silence that accompanies social transgression. Emily felt heat rising to her cheeks, aware of all eyes turning toward her. "I believe in standing up for what's right," she answered carefully. "The farm workers deserve fair wages and safe conditions." Farm workers," Uncle Howard scoffed. "You mean illegal Mexicans?" "They're migrant workers," Emily corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. "Most are American citizens. They harvest the food we're eating right now, but their children go hungry." "That's enough political talk at the table," Grandfather Mason interrupted, his tone ending any possibility of continued discussion. "Young women shouldn't concern themselves with such matters. Emily, your mother tells me you've turned down the teaching position at Harrisburg Academy. Perhaps you'd like to explain that decision to the family." The strategic pivot, From Emily's activism to her rejection of the respectable career her parents had arranged, created exactly the targeted discomfort Grandfather Mason had intended. Teaching at the private academy had been presented as the acceptable compromise. Emily could use her education without leaving Pennsylvania or challenging family expectations. "I've accepted a position with the Sacramento Gazette," Emily explained, attempting to infuse her voice with confidence. "As a photojournalist." "A newspaper photographer?" Aunt Margaret clarified, her tone suggesting Emily had announced a career in exotic dancing. "Photojournalist?" Emily corrected. "I'll be documenting agricultural communities and labor conditions throughout California's Central Valley." The silence that followed carried distinct notes of disapproval, broken finally by her father's forced chuckle. "Emily always did have unusual hobbies. I'm sure she'll get this activism business out of her system and come home when she's ready for a real career. And a family," her mother added with pointed emphasis. "Though at 22, you shouldn't wait too long." "Your biological clock?" "For God's sake, Catherine," Uncle Howard interrupted with wine-loosened candor. "Who's going to marry her looking like that? Hair like a hippie, metal in her face, and running around with protesters and Mexicans?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter circled the table, some genuine, some merely accommodating the family's designated truth-teller. Emily sat frozen, her carefully maintained composure cracking as relatives she'd known all her life laughed at her appearance, her choices, her very identity. Only Daniel remained stone-faced, his eyes meeting Emily's across the cranberry sauce and candlesticks. In that moment of connection, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition of mutual alienation from the family that had once defined them both. "I need to use the restroom," Emily managed, placing her napkin beside her plate with deliberate care, rather than allowing herself the dramatic gesture of throwing it down. As she stood, her mother's voice followed her retreat. "Don't forget to remove that thing from your nose before family photos, dear." The laughter that followed her down the hallway contained the particular cruelty of family judgment, intimate, informed, and perfectly targeted to her deepest insecurities. In the powder room, Emily leaned against the sink, breathing deeply to contain the emotions threatening to overflow. The face in the mirror looked back at her with her grandmother's eyes, her father's stubborn chin, the unmistakable Mason nose, features that connected her to the family now laughing at her expense. She touched the small silver ring in her nostril, a reminder of the person she had become despite that genetic inheritance. The woman who had placed that ring, Luz Mendoza, daughter of migrant workers and now Emily's closest friend, had warned her about returning home. "They want the girl who left, not the woman who's coming back," she'd said while helping Emily pack for the cross-country drive. "Be prepared for them to try to make you small again." A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door expecting her mother with additional directives about appropriate appearance, but found Daniel instead, leaning against the hallway wall with the careful posture of someone perpetually in pain. "They're assholes," he said without preamble, his voice low enough not to carry to the dining room. "Every last one of them." The blunt assessment, so contrary to the polite fictions the Mason family maintained, startled a laugh from Emily. "Even Grandmother Rose?" "Especially Grandmother Rose," Daniel confirmed with the ghost of a smile. "She told me I should wear a longer sleeve to cover my unfortunate tattoo because it would distress the children." Emily glanced at his forearm where names and dates were inked in simple black, a memorial to friends who hadn't returned from Vietnam. "They don't know what to do with us," she observed. "We've seen too much of the real world to play pretend anymore." Daniel nodded, understanding implicit in his silence. After a moment, he asked, "Your photography? Is it good?" "Yes," Emily answered without false modesty. "It matters. It shows things people need to see. Like what they did to us in Vietnam?" The question hung between them, an invitation to shared truth unlike anything the Mason family typically permitted. "Like what we did to Vietnam," Emily corrected gently, "and what we're doing to farm workers here. The same system, different victims." Daniel absorbed this perspective with a thoughtfulness that distinguished him from the dismissive reactions of their other relatives. "I'd like to see your work sometime." "I have a portfolio in my car," Emily offered. "Grandfather would probably have a heart attack if I brought protest photos into the house, but maybe he should have that heart attack," Daniel finished, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Might be good for this family to face reality for once." Their conspiratorial moment was interrupted by Catherine Mason's appearance at the end of the hallway. "There you are, both of you. We're waiting to serve dessert. It's inappropriate to disappear during a family meal." As they returned to the dining room, Emily felt a subtle shift in her posture. Daniel's simple recognition of her work's value had provided unexpected reinforcement against the family's collective judgment. The table had been cleared for dessert, crystal dessert wine glasses now stationed at each place. Uncle Howard had clearly continued his enthusiastic consumption during their absence, his face flushed and voice carrying as he regaled nearby relatives with anecdotes from his country club. And then I said to him, "Not everyone can afford to have political principles. Some of us have businesses to run." He punctuated this with a laugh that several others dutifully joined. As Emily resumed her seat, she felt rather than saw the sidelong glances, the family's collective awareness of her absence and return. She straightened her spine, Luce's voice echoing in her memory. "Don't let them make you small." Across the table, Daniel's eyes met hers again, something resolute forming in his expression as Grandmother Rose began serving her famous pumpkin pie with ceremonial precision. The Mason family Thanksgiving continued its choreographed performance, unaware that the foundations of its carefully maintained order were already beginning to crack. The pumpkin pie, Grandmother Rose's closely guarded recipe that had won the county fair blue ribbon for 16 consecutive years, was served with the ritualistic precision that characterized all Mason family traditions. Grandmother Rose delivered each slice personally, the order of service reflecting the family hierarchy as clearly as assigned seating. Grandfather Mason received the first piece, followed by Emily's father Richard, then Uncle Howard. The men were served before women, older generation before younger, married before single. Emily, as an unmarried female of the youngest adult generation, would normally have been served last. But her recent status as family disappointment earned her an even greater indignity. Grandmother Rose pointedly skipped her entirely, serving even the children before acknowledging Emily's empty dessert plate with a small, satisfied smile. "Oh dear," she said with manufactured concern. "Did I miss you, Emily? How careless of me." The deliberate slight hung in the air, recognized by everyone at the table, yet acknowledged by no one. This was how the Mason family delivered its most cutting judgments, not through direct confrontation, but through these small, deniable acts of exclusion. "Here," Grandmother Rose said, finally placing a noticeably smaller slice before Emily. "Though perhaps you're watching your figure, California girls are so conscious of their appearance, aren't they? Despite evidence to the contrary." Her gaze flickered meaningfully to Emily's nose ring. Emily felt herself shrinking under the precisely targeted combination of body commentary and dismissal of her choices. The confidence she'd cultivated in Berkeley, surrounded by friends who valued her mind, her artistic eye, her passionate commitment to justice, seemed to evaporate in the suffocating atmosphere of family judgment. "Actually," she managed, her voice smaller than intended, "I've been published in Pacific Visions magazine. My photo essay on farm worker conditions." The statement, meant as gentle self-advocacy, landed in the conversational equivalent of dead air. After a painful pause, Uncle Howard broke the silence with a sharp laugh. "Published. Is that what they call it when you submit pictures to those hippie pamphlets?" He gestured broadly, wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his glass. "Next she'll tell us she's a famous artist." The laughter that followed spread around the table in ripples, some genuine, some uncomfortable but compliant with expected family dynamics. Even Emily's mother joined with a tight smile, her eyes communicating the perpetual message, "Don't make this difficult. Accept your place." "Pacific Visions is a respected publication," Emily said, the words emerging despite the crushing weight of collective dismissal. "They have a circulation of—" "Emily," her father interrupted, using the tone reserved for public correction of children and dogs. "No one wants a lecture on obscure magazines during dessert. Let's move to more appropriate topics." The familiar pattern, assertion, dismissal, correction, submission, had played out countless times throughout Emily's childhood. The expected next step was her quiet acquiescence, followed by redirection to acceptable conversation. Before she could respond, however, something unexpected happened. Daniel, who had remained largely silent throughout the meal, set down his fork with deliberate precision. The small sound somehow commanded attention, conversations pausing as he slowly rose to his feet. He reached for his dessert wine glass, raising it slightly. His expression remained composed, but something in his eyes had hardened. The same look Emily had glimpsed in photographs of soldiers who had reached their breaking point. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice steady and carrying unexpected authority. The unusual interruption of established proceedings created a ripple of confusion. Impromptu toasts were not part of the Mason Thanksgiving protocol, particularly not from younger family members. Grandfather Mason frowned slightly. "Daniel," The formal toasts have already... To Emily, Daniel continued, speaking over the family patriarch in a breach of protocol that caused audible gasps, whose photography doesn't just capture images, but truth, whose work has been recognized by people who actually matter in the real world, beyond this dining room. The silence that followed was absolute. The collective shock of witnessing such direct challenge to family hierarchy, momentarily overriding even the impulse to redirect or dismiss. Emily stared at her cousin, unable to mask her astonishment. In all her years of Mason family gatherings, she had never witnessed anyone, let alone another young family member, so directly contradict the established order of things. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on Emily, his glass still raised. To the only Mason at this table doing something that might actually make a difference in this messed up world. The silence following Daniel's toast stretched into uncomfortable territory. The Mason family collectively processing this unprecedented disruption to their carefully maintained order. Grandfather Mason's face had darkened to an alarming shade of crimson, while Emily's father Richard appeared frozen in mid-motion, dessert forks suspended between plate and mouth. It was Aunt Margaret who finally attempted recovery, her nervous laugh cutting through the tension. Well, how spirited. Daniel has always had such enthusiasm, hasn't he? Now, about the Christmas gift exchange. I'm not finished, Daniel said, his voice carrying the quiet authority he had developed commanding men in combat. I've sat at this table for 26 years listening to how things are supposed to be. Who Masons are, what Masons do, what matters. He gestured toward Emily with his still raised glass. Here's someone actually living with courage and conviction, and you're all laughing at her because she doesn't fit your narrow definition of success. Emily felt a surreal detachment watching this scene unfold, as though observing it through her camera lens rather than experiencing it directly. No one had ever defended her this way at a family gathering. Certainly not another Mason, and definitely not against the collective judgment of the family elders. Daniel, his mother said in the placating tone reserved for potentially embarrassing public situations, you're upset. The transition home has been difficult, we understand, but this isn't the place. When is the place, Mom? Daniel asked, turning toward her. When do we talk about what's real instead of pretending everything fits into this perfect Mason family picture? Emily's showing actual injustice through her work. She's using her talent to make people see what they don't want to see. He set his glass down with careful precision, then reached for the small duffel bag he kept near his chair, a military habit he hadn't abandoned, keeping essentials always within reach. From it, he withdrew a magazine, its glossy cover slightly bent from travel. Pacific Visions, November issue, he said, placing it on the table where everyone could see Emily's photo credit prominently displayed below a powerful black and white image of a young child working in a field. I bought it at the airport in Chicago. Recognized your name immediately. Emily stared at the magazine, then at her cousin. You saw it? You sought it out? Of course I did, Daniel replied with a hint of surprise. Your family. I wanted to see what you were doing out there in California. The simple statement, that families should actually care about each other's real lives, rather than just their compliance with expectations, landed like a revelation in the charged atmosphere of the Mason dining room. Grandmother Rose recovered her composure first, reaching for the serving knife with deliberate calm. I think we've had quite enough dramatics for one holiday. Who would like more pie? But the attempted return to normal proceedings faltered, as Daniel remained standing, his posture conveying he wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the head of the table, addressing Grandfather Mason directly. You know what they taught us in officer training? That leadership isn't about making people follow rules. It's about recognizing each person's strengths and helping them develop those strengths for the good of the unit. His voice carried no disrespect, only the certainty of someone speaking hard-earned truth. I've seen what happens when leaders fail to do that, when they try to force everyone into the same mold regardless of who they actually are. Emily watched her grandfather's expression shift from indignation to something more complex, the face of a man encountering a perspective he couldn't simply dismiss with patriarchal authority. The world is changing, Daniel continued, his gaze moving around the table. You can keep pretending it isn't. Keep laughing at people like Emily who see it clearly, but that won't stop it from happening. He reached for his glass again, raising it higher this time. So I'll say it again, to Emily Mason, photojournalist, truth teller, the family member I'm most proud to be related to today. The simple, direct praise, delivered without qualification or diminishment, created a crack in the facade of Emily's carefully maintained composure. Tears welled in her eyes as Daniel remained standing, glass raised, waiting for the family's response to his challenge. One by one, other glasses began to lift around the table. Michael, Emily's 16-year-old brother, was first, his quick movement suggesting both teenage rebellion and genuine pride in his sister. Then cousin Sarah, a college freshman who had remained silent throughout the meal. Uncle James, the family's most progressive member despite his corporate career, raised his glass with a small nod of acknowledgement. Even Emily's mother, Catherine, eventually lifted her glass, though her expression remained conflicted, caught between loyalty to her daughter and fear of her husband's disapproval. Richard Mason stared at his raised glass as though unsure how it had gotten there, while Grandfather Mason and Uncle Howard kept theirs firmly on the table, their rejection of the toast a visible statement of resistance to this disruption of family hierarchy. But something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamics. The Mason family's unified front had fractured, revealing individual members capable of independent thought and allegiance. The nervous glances toward Grandfather Mason for direction had been replaced by direct engagement with Emily and Daniel, the family rebels suddenly repositioned as potential leaders rather than disappointing outliers. As Emily raised her own glass in response to this unexpected support, she caught Daniel's eye across the table. In that moment of connection, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition that they had just changed the Mason family in ways that would reverberate long after the Thanksgiving dishes were cleared. The remainder of dessert unfolded in the uncomfortable aftermath of Daniel's toast, conversation fragmenting into smaller exchanges rather than the usual family-wide discussions directed by Grandfather Mason. The patriarch himself maintained a stony silence, his displeasure evident in the rigid set of his shoulders and the deliberate way he ignored both Daniel and Emily. When Grandmother Rose announced coffee would be served in the living room, the family's migration from dining room to more comfortable seating created natural opportunity for realignment. Emily found herself approached by relatives who had previously maintained careful distance, their curiosity about her photography suddenly legitimate following Daniel's public endorsement. "Do you have other copies of the magazine?" Cousin Sarah asked, genuine interest brightening her expression. "I'm taking sociology next semester. Your work would be perfect for my term paper on labor issues." "I have several in my car," Emily replied, still adjusting to this unexpected shift from family pariah to person of interest. "And a portfolio of prints that didn't make it into the final article. I'd like to see those too," Michael added, positioning himself deliberately beside his sister rather than with the other teenagers. "Maybe you could show me how to use that fancy camera Dad says you spent too much money on." Emily felt a complex mixture of emotions at this sudden attention. Gratification at being taken seriously mixed with wariness born from years of family judgment. She glanced across the room where Daniel stood near the fireplace, somewhat apart from the main gathering, watching the family's reconfiguration with the detached interest of an anthropologist observing tribal behavior. Uncle Howard, increasingly unsteady from continued alcohol consumption, approached Daniel with the aggressive bonhomie he typically directed toward younger family members he wished to dominate. "Quite the performance at dinner, Danny boy," he said, clapping a heavy hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Always the dramatic one, aren't you? First the war hero business, now this, championing of Emily's little hobby." Daniel removed Howard's hand from his shoulder with deliberate care. "Her work isn't a hobby, Howard. And what happened in Vietnam wasn't heroic. It was survival." The direct contradiction, delivered without the deferential tone younger Masons were expected to use with elders, created another ripple through the nearby family groupings. Conversations paused as attention shifted toward the second potential confrontation. Emily moved instinctively toward her cousin, recognizing that his defense of her had likely depleted the emotional reserves that kept his own war experiences contained. Before she could reach him, however, Grandfather Mason interceded, his authoritative presence creating immediate space around the potential conflict. "Daniel, I'd like to speak with you in my study," he said, the directive phrased as request, but delivered as command. "Howard, perhaps you'd help Catherine arrange the coffee service." The strategic separation of combustible elements reflected Grandfather Mason's lifelong approach to family management. Address disruptions privately, maintain public harmony at all costs. Daniel's challenging gaze suggested he might refuse the summons, but after a moment of visible consideration, he nodded once. "Actually," he said, turning toward Emily, "I'd like Emily to join us. What I have to say concerns her directly." The unprecedented modification of Grandfather Mason's directive created yet another break with established family protocol. The patriarch's expression tightened momentarily before he gave a curt nod of his own. "As you wish." As Emily followed the two men toward Grandfather Mason's study, the inner sanctum where family verdicts were typically delivered in private, she felt a strange calm replacing her earlier anxiety. Daniel's simple act of standing up for her, of seeing her clearly and valuing what he saw, had shifted something fundamental in her relationship to the Mason family dynamic. Whatever judgment Grandfather Mason might deliver, behind the closed door of his study, she would face it differently than she would have just hours earlier. The anxious granddaughter seeking approval had been replaced by a young woman standing in her own truth, supported by unexpected alliance. The transformation was evident in her posture, her steady gaze, the deliberate way she walked beside rather than behind the family patriarch. Watching from the living room doorway, Catherine Mason observed this subtle but significant change in her daughter, with an expression that contained both concern and something that might have been pride. As the study door closed behind the three figures, the remaining family members exchanged glances of speculation and uncertainty. The Mason Thanksgiving traditions had veered dramatically off script, and no one quite knew what new narrative might emerge when that door reopened. Grandfather Mason's study maintained the atmosphere of a previous era. Heavy oak furniture, leather-bound books lining built-in shelves, taxidermied evidence of hunting prowess mounted on paneled walls. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and furniture polish, sensory elements deliberately preserved, despite Grandmother Rose's modernization of other spaces throughout the house. He settled behind his desk with practiced authority, the position reinforcing the power dynamic that had defined Mason family interactions for decades. Rather than taking the visitors' chairs positioned at a calculated distance from the desk, however, Daniel guided Emily to the leather sofa against the far wall, a subtle resistance to the predetermined staging. "I've allowed this conversation out of respect for your service," Grandfather Mason began, addressing Daniel directly, "but I want to be clear that today's behavior was unacceptable. The Mason family does not conduct its disagreements in public, particularly not during holiday gatherings." Daniel met the older man's gaze without the deference expected of younger family members. "With respect, sir, what happened at dinner wasn't a disagreement. It was the family collectively dismissing Emily's achievements because they don't fit the narrow definition of success this family recognizes." Grandfather Mason's expression hardened. "Success is measured by contribution to family legacy and community standing. Protesting and taking pictures of migrant workers contributes to neither. That depends entirely on how you define legacy and community," Emily interjected, surprising herself with her steady voice. "My work is documenting injustice so it can be addressed. How is that not a worthy contribution?" The direct challenge from Emily, historically the most compliant of the grandchildren, visibly startled Grandfather Mason. He studied her with narrowed eyes, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "You were raised with certain expectations, Emily. The considerable resources this family invested in your education were not intended to produce a rabble-rouser with questionable associations." "Like migrant workers?" Emily asked. "Or perhaps you mean my roommate Luz, whose family has worked California fields for 3 generations, making it possible for people like us to enjoy produce year-round while barely surviving themselves?" Daniel remained silent, allowing Emily to advocate for herself rather than intervening. His presence beside her provided tacit support without overriding her voice, a form of allyship she hadn't experienced within the family before. Grandfather Mason's fingers drummed once on his desk, a tell that indicated he was recalculating his approach. "Your father informs me you've declined the teaching position at Harrisburg Academy, a position he worked very hard to secure for you despite your unconventional appearance and activities." "I declined because I've accepted a position better suited to my skills and interests," Emily replied. "The Sacramento Gazette values my perspective. The Academy simply wanted a Mason name on their faculty list. And you believe this newspaper job constitutes a better use of your education, of your family background?" "Yes," Emily stated simply. "I do." The straightforward answer, delivered without qualification or apology, created another moment of recalibration in the study's atmosphere. Grandfather Mason had built his authority on the assumption that family members fundamentally sought his approval, making his disappointment a powerful corrective tool. Emily's calm assertion of independent judgment challenged that foundational premise. Before he could formulate a response, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Sir, I'd like to share something I learned in Vietnam, something that seems relevant to this situation. The invocation of his military service, the one area where Grandfather Mason granted Daniel unqualified respect, created an opening in the otherwise confrontational exchange. My first week in country, My commanding officer gathered the new lieutenants and told us something I've never forgotten. He said, "The measure of leadership isn't maintaining control. It's recognizing when the situation has changed and adapting your approach accordingly." Daniel's gaze remained steady, his voice carrying the authority of hard-earned experience rather than inherited position. "The world Emily and I are living in is fundamentally different from the one where your leadership approach developed. Continuing to apply those old methods won't preserve the family, it will fracture it." The direct challenge to Grandfather Mason's leadership philosophy, coming from the family member whose military service most closely paralleled his own WPADUM experience, landed with visible impact. His expression shifted from authoritarian certainty to something more complex, the face of a man encountering a perspective that couldn't be dismissed through hierarchical authority alone. "The family expects certain standards," he said finally, though his tone contained more statement than conviction. "The family," Emily responded quietly, "is changing. As Daniel said at dinner, you can acknowledge that change and help guide it, or you can resist it and watch the family fracture around you." The simple articulation of his fundamental choice, adaptation or increasing irrelevance, resonated in the study's hushed atmosphere. Grandfather Mason's gaze moved from Emily to Daniel and back again, his expression revealing the internal calculation of a strategic mind reassessing available options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine inquiry that Emily had never before heard from the family patriarch. "This photography work, it's truly important to you? Not just rebellion against family expectations?" "It's who I am," Emily answered simply. "The work I'm meant to do." The study fell silent as Grandfather Mason absorbed this response, the grandfather briefly visible beneath the patriarch's carefully maintained facade. When he finally nodded, the gesture contained neither approval nor rejection, but something more nuanced, acknowledgement of reality rather than judgment of it. "I believe Grandmother Rose is serving coffee," he said finally, rising from behind his desk in the traditional signal that a private meeting had concluded. "We should rejoin the family." As they moved toward the study door, he paused, turning toward Daniel with an expression that combined reluctant respect with lingering authority. "Your toast was inappropriately timed and undermined established family protocol." Before Daniel could respond, Grandfather Mason continued with unexpected addendum, but its substance was not without merit. Emily's professional recognition deserves acknowledgement, regardless of its unconventional nature. The qualified concession, as close to approval as the Mason family patriarch was capable of offering in the face of challenged authority, represented a subtle but significant shift in the family's power dynamics. Not complete acceptance of Emily's choices, but recognition of her right to make them according to her own values, rather than inherited expectations. As they rejoined the family gathering, Emily noticed something had changed in the room's atmosphere. The usual deference toward Grandfather Mason now balanced against new attention directed toward herself and Daniel. The unified front of Mason family authority had fractured, revealing space for different perspectives to emerge and be considered. In that moment of transition, Emily recognized that Daniel's toast had accomplished something beyond personal vindication. It had created the first crack in a family system that had prioritized conformity over authenticity for generations, a small opening through which genuine connection might eventually grow. The remainder of Thanksgiving evening unfolded with the strange atmosphere of a familiar script being simultaneously performed and rewritten. The traditional after-dinner activities, coffee service, family photographs, selective reminiscence about approved Mason family history, proceeded with surface normality, but undercurrents of changed dynamics rippled beneath. Emily found herself positioned in the center of the family photograph rather than at the periphery where she had been relegated in previous years. The symbolic repositioning, directed by Grandfather Mason himself, communicated to the assembled family that her status had shifted, though no explicit acknowledgement accompanied the change. As family members began preparations for departure, gathering coats and exchanging formal farewells, Emily noticed Daniel standing somewhat apart, observing the family's choreographed goodbyes with the detached interest that had characterized his participation in Mason gatherings since his return from Vietnam. She approached him with the Pacific Visions magazine he had produced during dinner, now carefully folded inside her sweater. "I still can't believe you saw this, that you sought it out. I told you, your family," Daniel replied with the simple directness that made his rare statements so impactful. "Just because the rest of them didn't want to see what you were doing doesn't mean I shared their willful blindness." Emily studied her cousin with new understanding. "Your toast changed things, not just for me, For all of us, I think. Daniel's expression remained composed, but something in his eyes softened slightly. They needed to hear it. The way this family operates, the pressure to conform, to prioritize appearance over authenticity, it destroys people. Different ways for different people, but the damage is real. The quiet assessment cut to the heart of the Mason family dysfunction, with a precision that suggested long contemplation rather than impulsive observation. "Is that why you did it?" Emily asked. "To protect me from that damage?" "Partly," Daniel acknowledged, "but also because what you're doing matters. Using your talent to show truth that people would rather ignore, that's worth defending." Emily felt the unexpected sting of tears at this simple validation. Despite publication in a respected magazine, despite growing recognition in professional circles, some part of her had continued to measure her worth through the Mason family's judgment. Daniel's straightforward affirmation of her work's value reached past that conditioned response to something more authentic. "Your photographs," Daniel continued, his gaze steady but compassionate, "they show what's real. Not what people want to see or what makes them comfortable, but what's actually happening. We need more of that in this world, not less." Before Emily could respond to this assessment, they were interrupted by the approach of her mother, Catherine, her expression a familiar mixture of social propriety and underlying tension. "Emily, your father is ready to leave," she announced, the statement both information and implicit directive. "He has an early meeting tomorrow." "I'll be driving myself back to the apartment," Emily replied, the simple statement of independent plans rather than automatic compliance creating another small disruption to established patterns. "I told Grandmother Rose earlier. I have some photographs to show Daniel before I go." Catherine's momentary hesitation revealed her internal recalibration, the familiar parental authority now balanced against her daughter's demonstrated adult autonomy. "Well, make sure to thank Grandmother properly before you leave. And perhaps you and I could have lunch tomorrow, just the two of us?" The unexpected invitation, containing neither criticism of Emily's appearance nor questions about her phase, suggested Catherine, too, was adjusting to the shifted family dynamic. "I'd like that," Emily replied, genuine rather than obligatory acceptance. As Catherine moved away to join Richard near the front door, Emily turned back to Daniel. "Would you really like to see my portfolio? It's in the car. Some of the images are difficult, not typical Mason family viewing material." "Exactly why they need to be seen," Daniel responded, his first genuine smile of the evening briefly transforming his features, "especially in this house." As they moved toward the front door together, Emily became aware of family members watching their departure with varying expressions: curiosity, confusion, calculation. The Mason Thanksgiving had deviated irrevocably from its scripted performance, and no one quite knew what new patterns might form in the aftermath. Outside in the crisp November air, walking toward Emily's car to retrieve her portfolio, Daniel paused under the porch light. "You know this isn't over, right? One toast doesn't change a family system that's operated this way for generations." "I know," Emily acknowledged. Understanding the realistic assessment wasn't meant to diminish what had occurred, but to prepare her for the complexity of family evolution. "But it's a beginning. Someone finally stood against the collective judgment and said, 'This is wrong.' That matters." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "In Vietnam, we had a saying, 'The first one through the door takes the most fire, but makes it possible for others to follow.' Today, that was us. And I think others in the family might be closer to following than we realized." As they continued toward Emily's car, she considered this military metaphor for family transformation. The Mason Thanksgiving that had begun with her humiliation had evolved into something unexpected, not complete acceptance, but the first fragile opening toward authentic connection. Behind them, the farmhouse windows glowed with warm light against the November darkness, the tableau of perfect family gathering maintained for external observation. But inside those walls, something had fundamentally shifted, the beginning of a change that would continue long after the Thanksgiving dishes were washed and stored away for another year. Christmas Eve, 1972. Snow fell in thick flakes outside the Mason family farmhouse, creating the picture-perfect holiday setting that had graced family cards for generations. Inside, preparations for the annual Christmas Eve dinner proceeded with the meticulous attention to tradition that characterized all Mason family gatherings. Emily arrived deliberately early, her Volkswagen Beetle looking conspicuously out of place among the Cadillacs and Lincolns already parked in the circular driveway. She carried not only the obligatory hostess gift for Grandmother Rose, but a carefully wrapped package that held particular significance for the evening ahead. In the month since Thanksgiving, subtle but significant shifts had occurred in Mason family dynamics. Emily's lunch with her mother had evolved into weekly conversations that, while not always comfortable, contained genuine exchange rather than performance of prescribed roles. Richard Mason had begun acknowledging his daughter's career with cautious references to Emily's journalism work. Not full-throated support, but movement from his previous dismissal of her hobby. Most surprisingly, cousin Sarah had visited Emily's apartment to see her complete portfolio, returning to campus with copies of several photographs to use in a presentation about agricultural labor conditions. The small act of genuine interest from a younger family member suggested the potential for different relationships with the next generation of Masons. Emily found Daniel in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, while Grandmother Rose directed holiday meal preparations with her usual precision. His expression brightened visibly when he noticed Emily's arrival. "Perfect timing," he greeted her. "I was about to be assigned potato peeling duty despite my obvious lack of culinary skills." "Daniel was just telling me about his new apartment," Grandmother Rose interjected, her tone suggesting mild disapproval of his recent move from his parents' home to his own place in Philadelphia. "Apparently, young people nowadays prefer independence to family support. Sometimes space helps us figure out what kind of support we actually need," Emily offered, the gentle perspective creating another small challenge to Mason family assumptions about proper dependence on family structures. Grandmother Rose's expression suggested she might respond with one of her trademark subtle corrections, but she paused, reassessing. "Perhaps," she acknowledged with unexpected consideration, "though proper meals and regular laundry service seem fundamental regardless." This concession, minor but genuine engagement with a different perspective rather than automatic dismissal, represented another subtle shift in the family's communication patterns since Thanksgiving. As Christmas Eve dinner preparations continued, family members arrived in their carefully staggered pattern, maintaining the appearance of casual gathering while adhering to the unwritten hierarchy that governed all Mason events. Emily observed the choreography with the professional detachment she had developed through her documentary work, noting both the familiar patterns and the small disruptions that suggested evolving dynamics. Uncle Howard arrived conspicuously sober, his wife Margaret explaining he was taking a break from spirits during the holidays, a family-appropriate euphemism for the alcohol counseling Emily's father had quietly arranged following the Thanksgiving incident. Grandfather Mason monitored this situation with particular attention, his investment in family appearances balanced against increasing recognition of previously ignored dysfunctions. By 7 o'clock, the extended Mason family had assembled in the formal living room for pre-dinner drinks and carefully moderated conversation. Emily found herself approached by various relatives who now acknowledged her professional work with cautious interest rather than dismissal. The combined result of Daniel's Thanksgiving toast and Grandfather Mason's subtle but significant repositioning of Emily within the family hierarchy. When Grandfather Mason cleared his throat for the traditional Christmas Eve address, the family arranged themselves in their customary formation. Eldest generation seated, middle generation standing behind them, youngest members positioned according to behavior expectations rather than preference. "Before we move to dinner," he began with the formal cadence that had opened Mason family gatherings for decades, "I understand Daniel has an announcement he would like to share with the family." This unprecedented deviation from established protocol, allowing a younger family member to speak during what had traditionally been the patriarch's exclusive domain, created a ripple of surprise through the assembled Masons. Emily caught Daniel's eye across the room, his slight nod confirming this development had been planned rather than spontaneous. Daniel moved to stand beside Grandfather Mason, the visual composition suggesting not usurpation, but approved transition. Younger generation granted space by elders' choice, rather than through confrontation. "Thank you," he acknowledged, addressing his grandfather with genuine respect before turning toward the gathered family. "As some of you know, I've been exploring options for continuing my education, now that I've completed my military service." He paused, his gaze briefly finding Emily's in the assembled group. "I've been accepted into Columbia University's journalism program, with a focus on photojournalism and documentary studies. I'll be starting in January." The announcement that Daniel was not only pursuing higher education outside the Mason family's traditional business and law preferences, but specifically in the field they had previously dismissed as Emily's hobby, landed with significant impact among the gathered relatives. Glances were exchanged, subtle calculations of this development's meaning for family dynamics visibly occurring across the room. "Daniel has shown considerable aptitude in this area," Grandfather Mason added, his endorsement particularly meaningful given his previous dismissal of such pursuits. His perspective will bring valuable insight to this field of study. As family members processed this development, Emily understood its full significance. Daniel's choice represented not just personal direction, but deliberate alignment with her previously marginalized path, solidifying the alternative value system they had begun establishing at Thanksgiving. The Mason family Christmas Eve continued with its traditional elements, but the underlying narrative had shifted in ways that would reshape family relationships for years to come. What had begun with laughter at Emily's expense had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated: the beginning of a new Mason family legacy defined not by conformity to established patterns, but by authentic support for individual paths. Spring 1973 arrived with particular vibrancy in central Pennsylvania. The Mason family farmhouse grounds transformed by flowering dogwoods and carefully tended tulip beds. The Easter gathering represented the third major family holiday since the pivotal Thanksgiving that had begun reshaping Mason family dynamics. Emily arrived with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier, her portfolio case containing not just photographic work, but the advance copy of her first book, a powerful collection documenting agricultural labor conditions scheduled for publication that summer. The Sacramento Gazette had granted her extended leave to complete a more comprehensive examination of the issues her initial photo essays had begun exploring. Daniel met her at the door, his expression brightening with genuine pleasure at her arrival. His first semester at Columbia had transformed him in subtle but significant ways, the haunted look that had characterized his post-Vietnam presence gradually replaced by engaged purpose. Their regular correspondence had evolved into a meaningful collaboration, with Daniel providing written context for Emily's ongoing photographic documentation of social issues. "You're just in time," he greeted her. "Grandfather has called a family meeting before dinner. Something about evolving family traditions, which sounds suspiciously progressive coming from him." Emily raised an eyebrow, genuine surprise replacing her habitual wariness about Mason family gatherings. "Grandfather Mason voluntarily discussing evolution of anything? Are we sure he hasn't been replaced by an imposter?" Daniel's laugh, a sound rarely heard during family gatherings before recent months, attracted attention from relatives already assembled in the living room. Several nodded acknowledgement of Emily's arrival, the previous pattern of strategic avoidance replaced by varying degrees of genuine engagement. Cousin Sarah approached immediately, her college freshman awkwardness giving way to growing confidence in her own evolving identity. "Emily, I got an A on my sociology paper using your photographs. Professor Wilson asked if you might speak to our class next fall about documentary as social advocacy." This simple exchange, family members discussing Emily's work as legitimate contribution rather than embarrassing deviation, represented one of many subtle shifts in Mason family culture since Thanksgiving. Not universal acceptance, but space for different definitions of value and success that hadn't existed before. When Grandfather Mason called the family to order for his pre-dinner address, the assembled Masons arranged themselves with less rigid adherence to traditional hierarchy. Emily found herself positioned near the center rather than the periphery, her place in the family configuration reflecting her evolved status within its social order. The Mason family, Grandfather Mason began with his customary formal cadence, has maintained certain traditions for generations. These traditions have provided structure and continuity through times of significant change. The familiar opening seemed to suggest reinforcement of established patterns rather than the evolution Daniel had mentioned. Several older family members nodded approval, while others maintained careful neutrality. However, Grandfather Mason continued, introducing the conjunction that signaled unexpected direction. Traditions must occasionally be examined to ensure they continue serving their essential purpose: the maintenance of meaningful family connection across generations. This philosophical framing, positioning tradition as tool for connection rather than control, represented significant evolution in the patriarch's thinking. Emily caught Daniel's eye across the room, their shared recognition of this shift creating a moment of silent communication. "To that end," Grandfather Mason announced, "I am establishing the Mason Family Foundation, with initial funding of $1 million. This foundation will support projects that extend the family's commitment to community betterment while recognizing the diverse forms such contribution might take." The announcement created a ripple of surprise through the assembled family. The Mason name had long been associated with community philanthropy, but always directed toward traditional institutions, hospitals, museums, established civic organizations. A family foundation suggested more flexible engagement with causes beyond these conventional parameters. The Foundation's initial board will include representatives from multiple generations and perspectives, Grandfather Mason continued, his gaze moving deliberately to include both Emily and Daniel. Emily and Daniel have agreed to serve alongside Richard and myself, ensuring both continuity and evolution in the family's philanthropic focus. The strategic inclusion of the family's most visible nonconformists in this new power structure communicated unmistakable message about the Mason family's evolving values. Not complete transformation, but deliberate expansion to incorporate previously marginalized perspectives. Additionally, Grandfather Mason added, his tone suggesting this final announcement carried particular personal significance. The Foundation's first major project will be funding a traveling exhibition of documentary photography focusing on agricultural labor conditions in America. The exhibition will feature Emily's work prominently, alongside other photographers addressing similar social concerns. The public endorsement of Emily's professional focus, not merely tolerated but actively supported through significant family resources, represented complete reversal of the dismissive laughter that had characterized the Thanksgiving gathering 6 months earlier, not through confrontation or capitulation, but through thoughtful integration of diverse family strengths towards shared purpose. As Grandfather Mason concluded his announcement, inviting family members to review the Foundation prospectus he had prepared, Emily became aware of her mother Catherine watching her with an expression that contained both pride and something like wonder, the face of someone witnessing transformation they hadn't believed possible. The Mason family Easter gathering continued with its traditional elements: formal dinner, carefully orchestrated conversation, collective performance of family unity. But beneath these familiar patterns, something fundamental had shifted. The family that had laughed at Emily's unconventional choices now incorporated those choices into its evolving definition of the Mason legacy. All because one person had stood when others sat, raised his glass when others lowered theirs, and spoken truth that challenged collective judgment. Daniel's simple act of solidarity had created the first crack in a rigid family system, allowing authentic connection to gradually replace performed conformity. Thanksgiving 1973 marked the one-year anniversary of the pivotal dinner that had begun transforming Mason family dynamics. The farmhouse presented its traditional appearance: polished silver, inherited china, autumn floral arrangements precisely positioned throughout formal rooms. But beneath these familiar elements, substantial evolution had occurred in the family's internal structures and relationships. Emily arrived with Daniel, their collaboration having evolved into both professional partnership and deepening personal connection during the intervening year. Her recently published book on agricultural labor conditions had received significant critical acclaim, while Daniel's journalism studies had provided framework for their joint documentary projects examining social issues through complementary visual and written perspectives. As they entered the farmhouse together, Emily was struck by how differently she experienced the space that had once represented confinement within rigid family expectations. The physical environment remained largely unchanged, but her relationship to it had fundamentally shifted, from anxious compliance to engaged participation on her own terms. Grandmother Rose greeted them in the foyer, her traditional hostess persona somewhat softened by the year's developments. "Emily, dear, the National Review mentioned your book in their arts section. Not entirely favorably, of course, but significant recognition nonetheless." This acknowledgement, delivering family-appropriate criticism while simultaneously confirming legitimate professional accomplishment, represented Grandmother Rose's evolved approach to her nonconformist granddaughter. Not full embrace of Emily's perspective, but recognition of its legitimate place within broader discourse. The pre-dinner gathering in the formal living room revealed numerous subtle shifts in family configuration. Cousins who had previously maintained strategic distance now engaged Emily and Daniel with genuine interest in their work. Uncle Howard, maintaining his newfound sobriety with careful commitment, discussed potential business connections for the traveling exhibition the Mason Foundation was developing. Most significantly, Grandfather Mason had created space within the traditionally rigid holiday structure for family members to share personal and professional developments before dinner, rather than limiting such announcements to his own carefully curated family narrative. This simple procedural adjustment allowed legitimate acknowledgement of achievements that fell outside previously narrow definitions of Mason family success. When dinner was announced, the procession to the dining room maintained ceremonial elements while incorporating subtle adjustments to established hierarchy. Emily and Daniel were positioned near Grandfather Mason, rather than at the table's far end. Their evolved status within family structure reflected in physical proximity to traditional centers of power. As crystal glasses were filled and serving dishes positioned according to long-established protocol, Emily found herself observing the gathering with her documentary photographer's eye, noting both the maintained traditions and meaningful evolutions that characterized this transformed family system. Grandfather Mason rose for the traditional Thanksgiving toast, crystal glass raised in the gesture that had opened Mason family dinners for generations. His gaze moved around the table, acknowledging each family member with the careful inclusion that had replaced previous selective attention. The Mason family, he began with familiar formal cadence, has much to be thankful for this year. Business successes, educational achievements, community contributions, and most importantly, strengthened family connections that will sustain us through challenging times ahead. This subtle adjustment to the traditional toast, acknowledging diverse forms of achievement rather than prioritizing business and financial metrics alone, reflected the family's evolved value system while maintaining comforting ritual elements. As glasses were raised around the table, Emily became aware of Daniel watching her with quiet satisfaction, the expression of someone witnessing the meaningful results of a stand taken at significant personal risk. When the patriarch's formal toast concluded, Daniel rose from his seat, crystal glass still raised. The echo of his action 1 year earlier, standing when protocol dictated sitting, speaking when tradition required silence, created immediate attentive silence around the table. "If I might add a personal note of gratitude," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced post-war detachment. 1 year ago today, this family began an important conversation about how we define success, contribution, and connection across generations. His gaze moved deliberately toward Emily, the simple gesture recalling his original toast that had disrupted established family patterns. "I'm grateful that conversation continues, and that we're learning to see and value each member's unique gifts, rather than measuring everyone against a single standard." Around the table, other family members raised their glasses in affirming response, not the hesitant, conflicted participation of the previous year, but genuine acknowledgement of the family's evolved understanding. Emily raised her own glass, meeting Daniel's gaze with the particular connection that develops between people who have challenged a system together and witnessed its transformation in response. Not complete reinvention, but meaningful evolution that created space for authentic participation rather than performed conformity. As the traditional Thanksgiving meal proceeded, conversation flowed with greater authenticity than previous gatherings had permitted. Different perspectives were offered and considered rather than automatically dismissed. Younger family members participated with increasing confidence that their contributions would be heard rather than merely tolerated. The Mason family Thanksgiving had become something new while honoring what deserved preservation in its traditions. The beginning of a legacy defined by mutual respect rather than hierarchical judgment. All because one person had stood when others laughed, raised his glass when others lowered their eyes, and demonstrated that family loyalty could mean standing with someone rather than standing against them. In this transformed gathering, Emily recognized that the most meaningful change wasn't the family's eventual acknowledgement of her professional accomplishments, but their collective evolution toward seeing each member's authentic self rather than measuring compliance with predetermined expectations. The family that had laughed at her was learning, however imperfectly, to laugh with her instead. The following September, the Mason Family Foundation hosted the opening reception for Hidden Harvest, the traveling exhibition featuring Emily's agricultural labor documentation, alongside work from other social documentary photographers. The venue, Philadelphia's prestigious Atherton Gallery, represented significant institutional recognition of work the Mason family had once dismissed as Emily's hobby. The exhibition space transformed the formal gallery with powerful black and white images documenting agricultural workers' experiences across America. Emily's photographs held central position, their unflinching portrayal of harsh conditions and human dignity commanding attention from the diverse audience of art patrons, social advocates, and media representatives. Mason family members arrived in carefully staggered patterns, maintaining the appearance of casual attendance while adhering to the evolved but still present family hierarchy. Grandfather Mason entered with deliberate timing that positioned him as significant but not dominant presence, a subtle adjustment to his traditional role that reflected his developing understanding of shared rather than absolute authority. Emily observed the gathering from a photographer's perspective, documenting this intersection of her personal history and professional achievement with practiced detachment. The Emily who had sat silently at the Thanksgiving table accepting family judgment had been replaced by a confident professional whose work spoke with authority beyond family approval or criticism. Daniel approached, champagne glasses in hand. His recent journalism award from Columbia, recognizing his written documentation accompanying Emily's photographs, had further legitimized their collaborative approach to social advocacy through complementary media. "Quite different from last Thanksgiving," he observed, handing her a glass with a smile that acknowledged the distance they had traveled. "Though I notice Uncle Howard is maintaining strategic distance from the open bar." Emily accepted the champagne with a small laugh. Family evolution has its limits. Some traditions are apparently sacred. Their shared understanding of Mason family dynamics, affectionate rather than bitter, observant without being judgmental, represented another evolution in their relationship to the family system that had shaped them both. As the reception reached its midpoint, Grandfather Mason signaled for attention with the subtle but commanding gesture that had directed Mason family gatherings for decades. The assembled guests, family members, art patrons, social advocates, media representatives, quieted with practiced social responsiveness. "The Mason Family Foundation welcomes you to this important exhibition," he began, his formal cadence providing comforting continuity amid substantial change. "Though perhaps I should more accurately welcome myself and other family members to Emily's professional achievement, which exists entirely through her own vision and determination." This public acknowledgement that Emily's success had developed despite rather than because of family support represented remarkable evolution in the patriarch's understanding, not just acceptance of different paths, but recognition of his own responsibility for previously blocking them. "The Mason family has traditionally measured success through financial achievement and community standing," he continued, his gaze moving deliberately toward Emily. "But true legacy consists of impact that extends beyond personal or family benefit to address broader social concerns. By that more meaningful measure, Emily's work represents the highest achievement our family has produced. The public validation, delivered with the full weight of patriarchal authority that had once dismissed her choices, created a powerful moment of completion in Emily's journey from family outlier to recognized pioneer of evolved family values." When Grandfather Mason raised his glass toward Emily, the gesture deliberately echoed Daniel's Thanksgiving toast that had begun this transformation. "To Emily Mason, whose courage in pursuing her own path has helped this family discover a more meaningful definition of success and contribution." As glasses raised throughout the gallery, Emily found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the distance traveled since that Thanksgiving table, where family laughter had reinforced her outsider status. Not through confrontation or capitulation, but through persistent authenticity supported by one person's willingness to stand when others sat, speak when others laughed, and recognize value others had dismissed. Daniel moved to stand beside her, their shared understanding of this journey's significance creating a moment of connection that transcended words. The transformation they had witnessed, and helped create, extended beyond Emily's individual vindication to fundamental evolution in how the Mason family understood itself and its purpose. As Emily raised her glass in acknowledgement of the toast, she caught sight of her mother Catherine watching from across the gallery, tears visible in her eyes. Not tears of disappointment or social discomfort, but genuine emotion at witnessing her daughter's recognition by the family system that had once relegated her to its margins. The journey that had begun with laughter at a Thanksgiving table had culminated in this moment of public acknowledgement, not just of Emily's professional achievements, but of the family's capacity to evolve beyond rigid hierarchy toward more authentic connection. Thanksgiving 1975 marked the third anniversary of the dinner that had initiated transformation in Mason family dynamics. The farmhouse maintained its traditional appearance: polished silver, autumn decorations, the ceremonial presentation that had characterized family gatherings for generations. But beneath these familiar elements, profound evolution had occurred in the relationships and values connecting family members across generations. Emily arrived with her camera equipment and portfolio, professional tools now welcomed rather than dismissed within the family gathering. Her documentary work had expanded to national recognition, with a second book scheduled for publication and regular contributions to major publications. The persistent vision that had once been ridiculed as impractical idealism had become her established professional identity, respected both within and beyond family circles. Daniel greeted her at the door, their collaboration having evolved into partnership that transcended professional connection. His journalism career had developed its own distinct path, while maintaining complementary focus on social documentation, their different media approaches creating comprehensive portrayal of issues they both considered essential to public awareness. The pre-dinner gathering revealed numerous subtle but significant shifts in family configuration. Cousin Sarah, now in graduate school studying social policy, engaged Emily in serious discussion about incorporating documentary evidence in legislative advocacy. Uncle Howard, maintaining consistent sobriety through ongoing recovery work, had redirected his business connections towards supporting community development projects the Mason Foundation had begun funding. Most significantly, younger family members now approached Emily and Daniel with genuine interest in their perspectives, rather than the careful distance previous generations had maintained from family outliers. The evolution toward authentic engagement rather than performed conformity had created space for multiple definitions of contribution and success within the extended family system. When dinner was announced, the procession to the dining room maintained ceremonial elements while incorporating adjustments to established hierarchy that had become standard practice rather than conscious accommodation. The traditional Thanksgiving meal unfolded with familiar rituals alongside evolved conversation patterns that allowed genuine exchange rather than performed agreement. Grandfather Mason rose for the customary toast, crystal glass raised in the gesture that had opened family dinners for decades. His gaze moved around the table with the inclusive attention that had replaced previous selective focus. The Mason family, he began with formal cadence that provided comforting continuity amid substantial change, continues its evolution while honoring traditions that deserve preservation. This balance, between respecting our history and embracing necessary change, represents our most meaningful legacy across generations. As glasses were raised around the table, Emily became aware of the documentary photographer's perspective she maintained even within personal moments, observing both preserved traditions and meaningful evolutions that characterized this transformed family system. When the patriarch's toast concluded, Daniel rose from his seat, crystal glass still raised. The echo of his original action, standing when protocol dictated sitting, speaking when tradition required silence, created attentive response rather than shocked silence, the gesture now incorporated into evolved family tradition. "If I might continue a tradition we began 3 years ago," he said with quiet confidence that had replaced previous hesitation. "I'd like to acknowledge how far we've traveled as a family since that Thanksgiving, when laughter at one member's choices became opportunity for collective growth." His gaze moved toward Emily, the simple connection recalling their shared journey from family outliers to respected contributors to evolving Mason legacy. "I'm grateful that this family has learned to recognize that our greatest strength lies not in conformity to single standard, but in supporting each member's authentic gifts and contributions." Around the table, other family members raised their glasses in affirming response. Not hesitant participation, but genuine acknowledgement of the family's transformed understanding. Emily raised her own glass, the gesture containing appreciation for both preserved traditions and evolved relationships. The journey from excluded outlier to respected contributor had transformed not just her place within the family system, but the system itself, creating space for authentic connection that transcended performed conformity. As the traditional meal continued, conversations flowed with genuine engagement across generations. Different perspectives were offered and considered rather than automatically dismissed. Younger family members participated with confidence that their contributions would be valued rather than merely tolerated. In this transformed gathering, Emily recognized that the most meaningful evolution wasn't the family's eventual recognition of her professional accomplishments, but their collective growth towards seeing each member's authentic self, the beginning of a legacy defined by mutual respect rather than hierarchical judgment. The laughter that now filled the dining room had transformed from weapon of exclusion to expression of genuine connection, not despite differences, but because those differences were finally recognized as strengthening rather than threatening the family's collective identity. All because one person had stood when others laughed, raised his glass when others lowered their eyes, and demonstrated that family loyalty means standing with someone when they need it most. At Thanksgiving, my family laughed at me, until my cousin stood and raised his glass to my name, reveals profound truths about family dynamics, personal authenticity, and the transformative power of a single act of solidarity in moments of public humiliation. Like Emily Mason, many of us have experienced the painful contradiction of family gatherings, where we're simultaneously expected to participate while being subtly or openly ridiculed for the very qualities that make us who we are. Her journey reminds us that authentic connection requires seeing each person's unique gifts rather than measuring everyone against narrow definitions of success or acceptability. Daniel's courageous toast, standing when others sat, speaking when others laughed, demonstrates how a single act of solidarity can initiate transformation in even the most rigid family systems. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful support comes not through confrontation or capitulation, but through simply bearing witness to someone's value when others have failed to see it. If this story resonated with you, consider, where might you need to stand for someone facing family judgment or social exclusion? Who stood for you during moments when you felt most alone or misunderstood? How might your own family evolve toward recognizing and supporting each member's authentic gifts rather than requiring conformity to narrow expectations? Subscribe for more stories exploring the complex territories of family relationships, personal authenticity, and the courage required to challenge systems that diminish rather than celebrate individual differences. Remember that sometimes the most profound change begins not with grand confrontations or dramatic departures, but with one person willing to raise their glass and say simply, "I see you, I value what you bring, and I'm standing with you when it matters most." What glass might you need to raise today, and for whom?